I'm very pleased to get a chance to be with you. Some of you may remember, and I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was just a couple of years ago that I had an opportunity, 3 years ago, I had an opportunity to talk to you then. The good news is I was just re-elected, so I'm going to get to be around for a little while. Yeah, thank you. The bad news is I get to be around for this legislative session, so here we go. I want to talk to you about the budget, and I have a very strong perspective about the budget. And I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago where I was laying out how I thought things were going to play out. And I said I kind of feel like I'm in one of those movies where there's a movie poster, and the headline for the movie is, "Nothing good is going to happen." And that's what everybody says. And it's become kind of the conventional wisdom at the Capitol that nothing good is going to happen. As though that if we say that over and over and over again, we keep repeating that mantra, either one of two things will happen. A, nothing good will happen, or B, we'll all just go along with that. That if we just say it long enough, we'll say, well, that's just the way it has to be, and because of that, we're nothing good's going to happen, so we'll be all right. Well, in my view, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that nothing good is going to happen. We live in a state that is a great state, has lots of resources, has wonderful people, and has enormous potential. If what we will do, in my view, is focus on it in the right way so that really, really good things can happen. So let me tell you a couple of my thoughts on this. Number one, it's becoming harder and harder to sustainably balance the Texas budget. And I'll talk about why I think that is in just a second. But it's becoming harder and harder to sustainably balance the Texas budget. Used to, when we talked about balancing the budget during a legislative session, it was at least thought in our heads that once we got the budget balanced, it would be balanced sustainably, that you'd come back 2 years later and you'd still be able to balance it, and 2 years later you'd be able to balance it again. But that's not the case anymore. The second thing I want to point out is what that means is it is becoming harder and harder for us to invest in things that are patently good for the state of Texas and our people, and frankly for our economic development over the long haul. I look at this through the eyes, frankly, of two people. One's named Preston Watson. Preston Watson is my 21-year-old junior at the University of Texas. Yeah, there you go. And Cooper Watson, who is my 15-year-old sophomore at Austin High School. And here's the scary part. Because the budget is so hard to sustainably balance, therefore making it so hard to invest in things that are patently good for the state of Texas, I believe that Preston Watson and Cooper Watson stand the chance of being the part of the first generation of Texans that don't inherit any excess capacity in the things they need to build their quality of life and their economy. That's a frightening thought. And a pretty significant statement. You know, when Liz and I got out of school, when we first moved to Austin, Texas in 1981, think about it, in 1981, there was excess capacity throughout the state when it came to roadways. Because those who had come before us had made appropriate investments in our transportation infrastructure. When we came to Austin in 1981, there was excess capacity in higher education. We were able to recruit from the world over to come to Texas to go to schools because of our great higher education opportunities, and we had made the folks that had come before us had been willing to leave a legacy of making those kinds of investments. Public education, health care, you name it. Our parents and our grandparents saw the legacy as being not just what they did at that moment in history, but what they left to generations that came after them. Think about it. Preston and Cooper stand the chance with what we're doing. At the end of this cycle, by the way, at the end of this biennium, there will be $0 available, zero, for any new construction in roadways. $0. The TxDOT is already cannibalizing maintenance money to build new capacity in a state that brags, and appropriately brags, that we're growing. How will they get the goods and services where they want it in their generation? How will they enjoy a quality of life where they can get from one part of this state to another part of this state? And that's just transportation. We can talk all you want about higher ed and the cuts that are being faced there. We can talk about what we've actually done over the last decade. But the point being, we are creating the first generation of Texans that will look at us and say, you left me nothing. And by the way, that first generation of Texans is going to have to do it different than we had to do it too. They're going to have to do it competing on a worldwide basis with jurisdictions that are making investments in infrastructure and their long-term futures. Now, it's getting harder and harder to balance the budget sustainably, which makes it harder and harder for us to invest in the future and things that are good for the state of Texas. Why is that? Well, it's because for over a decade now, right at a decade, Texas has dealt with its budget process, in my view, by debt, diversions, and deception. Debt, diversions, and deception. And if you look, I'll talk just briefly about debt, but if you look at what we've done in terms of debt, a state that prides itself as a pay-as-you-go state that always balances the budget, well, the truth of the matter is our debt service, money spent, money appropriated on debt service has gone up over 200% in the last decade. And most of that, by the way, has been in the area of road construction. We've gone from the old proud pay-as-you-go state to a state now that's relying more and more on debt. I find it interesting. Let me tell you, TxDOT gets under my skin about that quick. And I'm vice chair of the Senate Committee on Transportation, so I stay about half irritated all the time. But one of the things about TxDOT that's a very interesting thing is the only time I've actually really felt sorry for them is once when they were in front of our Senate, a joint meeting of the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Committee regarding transportation. And during that meeting, they were basically saying we're out of money, which they are. And one of the very powerful members of the Senate said, we just gave you several $billion last session. Well, what they gave was the ability to borrow several billion. And the poor guy was sitting there looking, as though that credit card that they were given was new money, right? That's how they acted like. But that poor guy was looking at it, and you could tell he didn't want to say what was on his mind, which was, but I don't trust you to give us the money to pay the debt. And I really did kind of feel sorry for the guy. But lots more debt. Diversions. Mention two things to you. One of the diversions is in the area of transportation. It's one everybody tends to know the most about. But most of our transportation funding goes into a fund that's known as Fund 6. Now, it's a very general thing, and it's paid for through the motor fuels tax. When you put a gallon of gas in your car, you pay a motor fuels tax in the state of Texas. You also pay a federal one. You pay 20 cents for the state of Texas. By the way, that motor fuels tax hasn't been changed since 1991. What's interesting about that, of course, is the cost of everything else has gone up. But that stayed the same from 1991. Regardless of that, what has happened is session after session, they know they're doing wrong, and those in control, session after session, say, hey, we need to stop taking money out of the motor fuels, Fund 6, the motor fuels tax money, and spending it on other issues, other programs. Last session, the big three, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and then speaker, it was a different speaker, wrote a letter because they really meant it this time. They put it in writing. And they said, we've got to stop this. There must be a plan for stopping this. Well, there was no plan. There is no plan. And over $1 billion was diverted. Now, I would argue that that is in effect a structural deficit. If you do the same thing over and over and over again, and I'll give you $100 million, maybe 200, 500. But when you do it over and over again at at $1 billion and more, then at some point you have $1 billion or more structural deficit because you can't pay for everything. You're diverting that money. Well, there is no plan to fix it. Let me tell you the other big area of diversions. In the state of Texas, one of the games that gets played is they don't want to raise taxes or fees. So what those in control will do is they'll say, hey, let's find something people like. You like parks? Yeah, I like parks. Okay, well, how about if we put a small portion of the sporting goods tax and we dedicate it to parks and wildlife? Oh, I'd do that. Okay. How about if we, it gets hot in the summer, right? Well, yeah, it gets real hot in the summer. Some seniors and poor people can't afford the electric bills in the summer. Would you care if we put just a small fee, a small tax, if you will, on your electric bill, and we'll put it in a thing called the System Benefit Fund, and in the hot summer months, we'll use that to help seniors and poor people? Oh, well, I'm for that. Okay, that's what we'll do. Well, they do that over and over and over again. And then they don't appropriate the money for the dedicated purpose. In my opinion, that's a lie. So what they do, and I won't go into all the detail, but at the end of this biennium, there will be $3.7 billion of broken promises. Money that was promised to go for a specific purpose, and it doesn't. Again, I would argue that reveals some form of structural problem. If you have to do that. By the way, in 2003, it was $1.2 billion, and it's grown to $3.7. This practice is getting worse and worse. So debt, diversions, and deception. And the biggest deception I can give is in 2006, after the Texas Supreme Court had declared our school finance system unconstitutional, what happened was the legislature was brought into a special session, and what was said was, we need to fix the school finance system. What happened was there was a decrease, and a needed decrease in property taxes in our state. But there was a decrease of about $14 billion. Well, there was no service cut. Great political trick. I'll cut taxes, and I won't cut the services that everybody wants. So I win on both sides. Now, by the way, I wasn't in the legislature in 2006, so it's kind of easy to shoot at this. But those in control that did that, they were arguing they got the best side of both sides of the deal. Well, they had to replace the $14 billion, right? So what they did is they passed the new business tax. What some of you have heard is called the margins tax. The problem with that was, and they also raised the cigarette tax, and they did the liar's affidavit on the sale of used cars. But when you added all that up at the time, they knew it was only going to, or they said it was only going to raise about $8 billion. Well, I went to law school so that I don't have to do math. But even I, 14 minus 8, 6, thank you very much. See, I don't even have to do math in this room, see? So they started with a $6 billion deficit. And here's the worst news. The margins tax hasn't even lived up to its original promise. It's come in lower than that. And if you ask the comptroller, and I have actually forced some of these answers. One of the answers is that it's not just about the recession. That the lack of a margins tax is the way the margins tax is implemented and the way people are responding to the margins tax. So the problem is there's a structural deficit. And there is no plan for how to fix the structural deficit. Instead, what the plan was to set aside money. My first session of the legislature, I called it the mattress money. They took over $4 billion and they shoved it in a mattress. They called it the Property Tax Relief Fund. Well, what it was a mattress to cover up the deficit, that structural deficit. And of course, last session, they had the Perry bailout. $12 billion in stimulus. Now, I don't mean to be partisan there, but that's what it was. It was a bailout that was accepted by the state of Texas. $12 billion, a little over 6 of that they say went to direct offset of general revenue. But that also covered up. Well, here's the deal. It's all gone. The mattresses no longer are there. You can't cover it up. So the deception is going to have to come to an end. So where does that lead? I have laid out what I think is the first step to dealing with this. And that is, we need to have an honesty agenda. The state of Texas needs to have an honesty agenda in how it is we deal with the budget. I'm proud to tell you that the first step in the honesty agenda actually occurred last week. I fought for a significant change in the Senate rules so that the public would have a better opportunity to know what is in the final draft of the budget before the senators actually vote on it. And we had a major win. I didn't get everything I wanted, but you never do in the Senate, or you rarely do. But I did get a major change, and I can go into the details of it. It's a pretty kind of insider deal, but here's the bottom line. For 2 days before the Senate can vote on the budget now, you will have not only the conference committee report laid out, but you will also have a document known as the Outside the Bounds Resolution that is a roadmap for what the differences are between what the Senate version was and the House version was when it went into the conference committee and what has now come back. As was pointed out by the chair of finance, who is of a different party than mine, on the Senate floor, he said this has not ever been, this isn't in the rules. And Senator Watson's right. And so he ended up going along with it, and we were able to pass that, and it had unanimous support in the Senate. That's a major change in honesty in state government. I'm also pushing a couple of other things. One, I'm pushing that we need to have planning. And that planning needs to deal with things like how we're going to deal with the margin tax and that structural deficit, and how we're going to deal with other diversions to make sure that we're doing it right. I also have some transparency items. For example, I believe that people of the state of Texas ought to know what our financial condition is more than just once every 2 years. Frankly, a whole lot of work could have been done over this past year. Instead of getting into this 140 days where you're in a full sprint all the time and everybody's locked behind closed doors. So one of my bills would require that the comptroller provide revenue estimates and certain budget information quarterly, and that it be provided in an open meeting of the Legislative Budget Board where they have to accept it and listen to public testimony at the same time. And by the way, that would also have to occur anytime the big three decide they're going to say you have to have cuts, across the board cuts. You have to bring that. And I've got a number of other things. But my position is good can happen. Good can happen. But in my view, we start with taking a can opener to state government and making it truly honest and open for the people. Now here's the other part of the good, and then I'll be quiet and answer questions. The other part of the good that can happen, and let me be clear, there are going to have to be cuts. There are going to have to be cuts. We are in that deep a hole. This budget is a disaster. But as I just told you, it's not necessarily a natural disaster. But if what we're going to do is not have to do this over and over, if we're looking at 2013 and 2015, we're going to have to change the way we do that budget. What that means is we've got to have everybody in this room. If you care about public education in this state, you cannot act like, well, nothing good's going to happen. You've got to be over there, and you have got to be pounding the table that they need to fix this budget. If you care about higher education in this state, those of y'all that kind of cheered when I mentioned I had a kid at University of Texas, yes. If you want the University of Texas in the year 2020 to be something you recognize, then it is important for you to be involved in this process, because the way they're going about cuts is a frightening thing. Same as other schools of higher education that you may care about. if you care about our natural resources and things of that nature, you have to be involved in this process, because it is going to be one of those things that if you're not involved, if they're not hearing from you, I worry who they're hearing from. Do you get my point?
Yes.
And what that means is, not only will we not have an open, honest budget, but we will not have a budget that can be supported. Now, I will tell you, my position has been, and it continues to be, that I will not vote for any new taxes or fees. I will not vote for draconian cuts that are just across the board without any value system in place. And I won't vote to spend any part of the rainy day fund until there are these reforms. And I see your face, but here's the reason. If I vote to spend money on the rainy day fund and all it's being used to do is cover up structural deficits, then I'm enabling the process. If I vote to increase fees or taxes and I can't promise you they're going to go where we've told you they're going to go, then I'm enabling the process. The first step, now look, the rainy day fund is an economic stabilization fund, for goodness sakes. I can argue all day long why it ought to be used, or a portion of it ought to be used. But if it's only be used to allow these folks that are in control to use gimmicks and cover up their processes, I can't be for that. So the first step for me is you got to fix the process. You got to force a fix. And by the way, it takes 2/3 to bring up the budget in the Senate, and it takes 2/3 to get it to use any money in the rainy day fund. 1/3 of us can force some changes if we're disciplined and we're thoughtful about how we approach it.